So welcome everybody to our Zoom. I'm going to start this up in a couple of minutes, so just stay on hold and we'll get this going in just a couple of minutes. Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to wait one more minute before we get this started. Just one more minute and we'll get the program underway. Okay, why don't we get this thing started? First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We appreciate your attendance. We know everybody is so busy now, especially given all the things happening. But we think that this time should be well spent. We hope that we can provide an opportunity for you to have a discussion with some real experts in the field on how companies are coping with the coronavirus COVID-19, how they're managing their supply chains, what they're doing now and what they're doing in the future. And in fact, the theme for today is exactly that. It's about how can we struggle with the stresses we have right now, but at the same time, re-architect our supply chain to be ready for the future, because the new normal will be something very, very different than it is today. So my name is George Bailey, and I'm the Executive Director and Chief Research Officer for the Digital Supply Chain Institute. And in case you haven't heard very much about us before, we are a not-for-profit. We're based in New York City, but we really work globally. And we have companies who are members from Europe, Asia, US, Latin America, really around the world. And we're all about how do we create the supply chain of the future? How do we make a supply chain that improves revenue while it reduces costs? That's also resilient, that can withstand shocks like the coronavirus or other epidemics or other problems that could exist, and still deliver the things that need to be delivered to the customers and to employees. So that's what we do. That's why we're here today to talk about the coronavirus, the supply chain, and we're lucky enough to have some real experts with us. So we're going to actually broadcast this on YouTube Live, so some people will be watching this, and it'll be recorded and available for you afterwards if people need to see this. And we're very excited to have a discussion with people who are based not just in the US, but also outside the US. If you go to the next slide, please, Vivek. So here are the objectives that we've set for today. So 3 things. Number 1, I want to outline the overall impact of the coronavirus on global supply chains. So we've done that in the past 3 meetings we've had like this, and it's been really, really useful to hear what companies are doing and how they're doing it. So that's the first thing, especially on this topic of how can we redesign the supply chain to be more customer focused, not only to survive what's happening today, but also for the future. So outline that. That's the first objective. Second objective, describe what actions companies are taking really across all industries to deal with the coronavirus and all the adjacent issues that it has caused. And there are a lot of issues. You know, for example, in the US, the report came out that April was the lowest consumer spending in history, according to the last thing I read. I mean, it's really a huge impact on the demand side. And of course, for a supply chain, demand is the most important thing that drives everything else. So a huge impact on demand. Also a huge impact on costs, because people know they have to cut their costs because their revenue has shrunk. So how do you do all of that? Well, taking in potentially some government assistance, managing your employees, keeping people safe, and still providing service. Now, this discussion we're going to have today is not about the overall impact of the coronavirus on the world. It's not about the health impact. We're not experts on any of that, but it is about how companies can respond to it and what they can do to maintain their supply chains and make them stronger in the future. And you'll have some great examples, thanks to our presenters, in just a couple minutes here. And then finally, we want to, through this discussion, start developing recommendations about what you can do, what we can all do to help our customers and our shareholders get the returns that they need from the work that we do. So that's what we were here to do. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda, and we're going to really do our best to stick on this agenda. We found that the most important thing about these sessions that we have is the interaction. Now, the work we do as the Digital Supply Chain Institute includes meetings like this. We do collaboratories where we bring together experts and companies and have a robust discussion about the issues and come up with some plans for going forward. We also do primary research. We publish things. You can find all of that on our website, digitalsupplychaininstitute.org. A great place to access a lot of our materials from past meetings and future meetings. And we also do action research. We're actually on site with companies like yours, helping to make things better in the supply chain space. And often that involves a cross-functional look with not just supply chain, but also sales and marketing, finance, operations, and HR. So a broad look to make things better, because the truth is, in our view, and I think the view of the panelists that we have today and people who are working in supply chain, is the supply chain of tomorrow is going to be quite different than it is today. And the changes that we have to make have to be made now. And in some cases, you'll find companies telling you that this coronavirus problem is a tragedy, but on the other hand, it's a stimulus for change. So right now, people are going through a whole lot of things to change their supply chain to make it more aligned with their vision of the future. So I'm kicking off. I'm going to hand it over to Hans, and Hans is from SAP, the world's leading software company, particularly in the ERP space. He's responsible for the digital supply chain thought leadership, IoT, really thoughtful, works with companies all around the world, and be able to describe to you some really great insights about how companies are dealing with this and what they're doing. So you're going to enjoy hearing from Hans. The next speaker is from NCR, another great company. She's actually based in Serbia, in Belgrade, where NCR has a major center, quite active. And she'll be able to describe to you what her company is doing and some perspectives on what the future will be like. Now, I want to be really clear about these meetings. These meetings are called collaboratories because it's all about collaboration and sharing. So please be sure that you know that you can click on the Q&A button and input questions throughout the session. And we really need you to do that because we've deliberately kept our speaking time short and our PowerPoints few so that we can have a bigger discussion. And we've done this the past 3 times, and it's been great. The more discussion, the better people like the session. So please use the Q&A key. Some of you are members or work closely with us, and you'll automatically be able to speak during the session. So keep yourself muted, but when it's time to speak, please go ahead and let us know, and we'll, I'll make sure that you can ask your questions or make your comments as we go through this. We'll do all of that until 9:55 a.m. New York time, and at that point, we will make some closing observations and summarize and end the collaboratory. And we'll be sure to end it at 10 a.m. New York time to make sure all of you have your day that you can work. Now, I know that some of you it's evening, some of you it's morning, and some of you afternoon. So I'm just going to let you navigate through that. But we've got some great material that I think will keep you focused on it. Next slide, please. So here's back to my main point I made earlier. Companies are very much focused on surviving the present. It's everything they can do to stay focused on meeting the customer's needs, making their financials work, and delivering what has to be delivered through their supply chains. But at the same time, they're preparing for the future. There's a lot of uncertainty right now about When economies are opened up, what will the health impact be? But we're going back to work. We're putting things in place. We're running our supply chains. We're going to make this. This happen. However, there's challenges everywhere. I just highlighted one particular challenge. This is a U.S. perspective. In the U.S., for example, the main source of many of our pharmaceuticals is China, and in fact, it's 95% of ibuprofen, and so on and so on. Big percentages of our pharmaceuticals come from China, and that could become an issue if we don't manage those supply chains well. So the pharma companies are really focused on making that work. A third point is that demand is repressed across many sectors and very difficult to predict when the recovery will happen. And uncertainty is the enemy of business. It's certainly the enemy of supply chain. If you're uncertain about how many is going to be needed, it's hard to gear up and make your supply chain work. So reliability is important, and resiliency becomes a key word that has to be built into everybody's supply chain. In the US, unemployment figures are really kind of hard to get. Around the world, they're not so available. But many people estimate that the supply chain impact on employment is, and across all of industries, is quite severe. In fact, probably in the US, as much as 30% of jobs may have been lost. Now, the good news is, never waste a good crisis. Companies are preparing supply chains for the new normal, and we've got a lot of changes taking place that will be very valuable for you to hear about. So remember, super important to ask questions, super important to interact, and super important to make this a very discussion kind of session. So let's go ahead and go forward and get started. Here's the one slide I'm going to present, then I'll turn it over to Hans. Actions that are being taken right now. So setting the digital supply chain strategy, that's happening real time. People are making it work now, but they're also thinking about how they're going to meet the new customer needs, how they're going to be more online, how they're going to create more benefit. And a key word there is horizon. People are trying to make their planning horizon longer and more in depth than it is today. They want to know more about the customer, more about the operations, and get it done. So horizon. Second factor is location. As part of this new strategy that people are developing, there's more and more focus on making things near shore. So that's a key factor. Third is aligning people. People are always identified as the number one challenge and the number one opportunity across supply chain world and across the business world. And we have to do two things: reduce expense while we're seeing less revenue come in, but we have to make sure we build a very focused, highly energized set of heroes that are really doing the right job. So we need heroes to carry us forward. Fourth is resiliency, the word that you're going to hear more and more. How can you be more agile? How can you be working with alternative suppliers? How can you be very tough, even in the worst kind of conditions? And then finally, it's all about recovering the customer and the business, managing cash flow, investing in the future, and really providing the kind of service that needs to be provided. And it's about managing those financials to make it happen. So that's my beginning discussion, and I'm going to turn it over right now to Hans. And Hans, will you take us through your slides, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, George. And thanks for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's very important. And following the theme which you laid out in terms of change and what we see what's going on. So in my role at SAP, I work with hundreds of companies around the world. And what I try to do is really summarize what I hear and then present it to you and have this discussion on where we think right now, where things will go and what is happening. So if we jump right into the discussion on the next slide, please, then I think it's very obvious. Supply chains are very distressed right now. You could even say broken. And I follow it extremely closely around the world, especially here in the US where I live. I sit here in San Francisco. And it's quite interesting, right? What we saw, that no visibility in ventilators, no visibility in personal protection equipment. So everything what hospitals need. There was really no idea what is really needed in the hospitals, how much is needed. There were some demand figures by hospital or per hospital, but not really in the supply chain. Everybody started to think, what can we do and what can be done? So that was on the hospital side, on the healthcare side. If you look at the food supply chain, right at the beginning, actually not food, but consumer products, right at the beginning, toilet paper was the biggest issue, right? And nobody expected that. And still, until now, nobody understands why. But toilet paper was running out of stock immediately. And still up to today, it's not yet replenished. Interestingly enough, when I talked to some of these manufacturers produce toilet paper, they would argue we are not increasing production. The reason is if they would increase production, it would end up in warehouses. And as you can easily see, it's quite a lot of volume with toilet paper, but the price is very low. So the cost would go up and profitability would go down. So they say the overall population is not increasing. So we just continue to produce what we produce and not put things now into warehouses where we would lose money, right? Very interesting observation on toilet paper. Then the next thing what happened was that some of the goods like eggs and some dry food actually was an issue. Now it's about meat here in the US. So because some of the pork facilities and so on and really have an issue with COVID-19. So lots of people are sick there, so they cannot produce. So the whole food supply chain breaks more and more. You see farmers actually really getting rid of products, and at the same time you see people really hungry. So it's really not a nice thing to see, and a very bad thing to see, to be honest. But it just shows us supply chains are really broken right now. What this means is quite interesting, that overall global supply chains are not built in order to support something like a pandemic. We had no issues, right, with local events. That's the interesting thing. When you think about all the major events or major issues which happened the last 10 years, from even trade wars between US and China, from earthquakes, from hurricanes, and so on. So whenever an event is local or limited to one or two countries, supply chains were well oiled and really worked very well. But now we see actually in this global pandemic, it really breaks down. What it also means is that supply chains are still very transactional. It's still the situation that 99% of the companies around the world run a supply chain where they react to things which happen. So if there's an issue, then I react. So I have an alert, I have an issue in the demand side, on the supply side, now I react and I try to fulfill. We didn't make yet the switch into this industry 4.0 concepts, into this data-driven concepts where I have data and I project, I predict actually the outcome, right? So one of the big learnings is we're still not really using data, which is available, how I could predict better the outcome, how I could predict the forecast and everything what will happen. I think this is a big learning. The first key statement I would say is this change from reactive supply chain to a predictive supply chain will be accelerated. On the next slide, I try to actually talk a little bit about why is this, right? So why are we not prepared for a global pandemic? Why do we have no issue with local? And then I started thinking about really where we are coming from, right? And if you go back 30 years, something like this, the basic idea was really that I want to produce products which are more affordable, and I want to offer these products to the mass market. And one of these ideas was I can produce these products wherever, and I choose to produce with cheap labor so that I can offer it in more affordable way. So this was this whole concept around outsourcing. Many companies really started the outsourcing process. This is why lots of manufacturing happens in China or in Asia in general, in order to really achieve the affordable products in mass market. So there we have the manufacturing centers in Asia. And then what happened was that companies like Amazon, Alibaba came along, and they said, well, we can not only produce products in affordable and provide it to the mass market, but we can ship it very, very fast. So this idea of 2-day, 1 day, 1 hour shipment were introduced. So now all of a sudden I had not only affordable products for the mass market, I also had the fast delivery, and they really did a wonderful job, I would say, right? So even until today, when you think about, especially now in the crisis, how many packages are being sent around the world, and the volume which is being sent, it's amazing. And without all these services which have been introduced based on the same concept by many companies, not just by Amazon, Alibaba, but by many companies, how they can actually send products to the customers, is really helping us in this crisis. Think about if this would not be the case. Think about if there would be no food delivery, if there would be no delivery of products to companies, but also to people in the way how we are used to have it right now. It would be a very, very different crisis, right? So I think something very good came out of that development. The next step was really that companies started to introduce more personalized products. So the idea not only having product for the mass market which are affordable and delivered fast, but also individualized for the consumer. So this is where more and more automation has been introduced in manufacturing in order to achieve that, really having differentiating products, maybe even really personalized products. And now the question is, how does that evolve into future? And I think this is what George mentioned already, really going hand in hand with this discussion around resilient supply chain. And a resilient supply chain suggests that you have actually a couple of suppliers which can provide the same product. So if something happens in one part or with one supplier, you have another supplier, you have in your supply chain or a plan B kind of concept in your supply chain. This can be very costly. And I think there will be some restrictions to that. I think actually a concept, and George also mentioned that, which we will probably see, is that more and more companies will start to produce locally. The supply chain will still be run on a global level. Also, the design of the products will run on a global level, but the production and the delivery will be done on a local level. Why I'm so convinced about this? Because I think this goes hand in hand with the sustainability discussion. Yeah, the sustainability discussion, carbon footprint discussion is not going away. It will continue, even if right now, actually the world is relaxing a little bit, but I think actually this will come back very, very soon and will be a very important topic going forward. And of course, local production with local suppliers, with the supply chain and the logistics part on the local level has a huge impact in how also on the carbon footprint side. So I think there are two elements to it, making it more resilient, but also addressing the carbon footprint aspect hand in hand. So the concept of a local, more localization, local supply chain, I think will evolve out of this. And there are companies who did that already in the past. You just need to look at a company like McDonald's, who since quite some time actually are always in the Gartner top 25 list when it comes to running their supply chain. They source locally and deliver locally, but always provide the same type of product and the branding and so on. So this type of concept we see actually evolving and accelerating right now. What we think actually what will happen is, in combining these elements of localization and sustainability, is really the design for a sustainable supply chain. You could even say a resilient, sustainable supply chain, but sustainable supply chain. And it really has, of course, the customer in the center. It really focuses on the supply chain and reducing the risk, increasing resilience, and focus on the delivery elements. On the engineering side, it will require to really think about the product requirements, the regulations in every country, of course, the cost. And on the manufacturing side, it's a lot of automation, which is necessary in order to do that and produce locally and have that quality high. Which leads me to the last slide I want to present, is really the idea of the current crisis. In general, in the discussions, all the discussions I have with companies really points to one thing: it will accelerate the industrial transformation. It will not stop or delay it. It will actually accelerate these new concepts. Many companies really think of the supply chains are broken, we need to build them new. And in order to do that, what is it actually where we're going to? It's not just fixing the old, it's really thinking about the new. And here there's some differences in some regions, but it's really about thinking about something new. And this is all around the industrial transformation, combining these topics I mentioned. It's really thinking about Industry 4.0 and end-to-end process, not just the factory process, but really end-to-end, which has the customer in the center, reinvents production and connects the business partners. So that's the idea, that's the discussion I want to put on the table here, and looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Hans. That was great. A lot of good insights, and I know you look clear across the world on these things. And I also appreciate the fact that it's quite early in the morning for you now. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
The next speaker is going to be Maria from NCR, and again, please get ready to ask your questions with the Q&A button, or also have some discussion, verbally afterwards. But Maria, would you take us through your slides now?
Sure. I'm sharing my screen. Can you hear me? Okay, there you go. Excellent. So thank you for inviting me, Chris and George, and thanks for everyone for being here, and thanks to Hans for that great perspective on the supply chains. I'll focus my next few minutes on a perspective from a task force leader for a global technology company in terms of what does the re-entry into office look like, and what are we currently thinking through as we're thinking through the new normal as an employer. So if you would advance to the first slide, I'll just quickly, next one, please. I'll just quickly set a perspective. Many of you are probably familiar with NCR. We're a global technology company. We've been around for quite some time, 136 years, and we have 45,000 people around the world, and we operate in probably over 170 countries. And that presented us with both an advantage and an interesting challenge when the pandemic took off. The advantage was that we had early signs and lessons learned from our colleagues in Asia, especially in China. And we were able to stand up our task force very early this year, in early January. And it started with focusing on China and supply chain. And then very quickly, the task force mission expanded to the entire company and our global workforce. And from the very beginning, one thing that we focused on in terms of how are we actually managing the pandemic for NCR was establishing a very clear mission and guiding principles. So in January, we said employee safety, number one priority, customer safety and business continuity. Those three filters will guide everything that we do. And these 45,000 people around the world support banks, retailers, restaurants, all of the essential businesses that have been proclaimed essential during the pandemic. And 50% of them are office population. The other 50% are either in manufacturing, logistics, fulfillment, and or customer engineers who are actually maintaining ATMs and maintaining our equipment and other people's equipment around the world in stores and in banks and in restaurants. And so as we're considering the re-entry, it's kind of interesting to say that the January, February, and March were actually simpler than the re-entry process because we now know that we're going to have to add this fourth principle or filter to our mission as a task force that's managing a pandemic, which has everything to do with clarity of expectations. As we move back into the new normal, we understand that as an employer, as leaders, as managers, we will have to communicate a whole lot to our employees in terms of what are our new expectations, logistics, behavioral, operational, safety guidelines. Everything will be different. And it's not the return to normal. It is a return to abnormal. It's a completely new norm in every way that you can imagine. So let me expand a little bit on that. If you would advance to the next slide. Most people, when they think about the re-entry as an employer, they start asking themselves a range of questions. And anyone that you talk to will probably land on this upper right corner, questions related to What does the workplace look like when you re-enter? How do you reduce risk? Will we do temperature checks? Will people shake hands? Will we require face masks? Will we stop services and close common areas? And pretty much everyone was thinking about that, every employer that you speak with. But there is a range of questions and categories of questions that actually surround this entry into office and have to be answered even before you think about how you configure your office and the behavior in the office. What is enough to actually trigger a reentry? What are you as an employer looking at? Are you looking at a government statement? Are you looking at government and healthcare statement? What is enough to actually tell you that it's safe to even consider reentry? What criteria is relevant to determine who returns to office? This is a really big one for employers. Using just the critical and essential definitions is probably not good enough anymore. There will be serious thought given by many employers in terms of who are the at-risk populations. How do you treat them? How do you train managers to have conversations, to ask questions that they have been not previously allowed to ask by law? They still can't ask, but they have to protect their employees from being at risk and being invited back into office. Do you have to set up special accommodations? Who is key personnel that should go back first? Who decides that? What if the employee refuses to return into the office? What are the rules of engagement then? What about childcare and closed schools? It's interesting, I spoke with one of my task force colleagues from another company, another Atlanta company, and they've done pulse surveys of their employees around reentry. 2/3 of their employees had issues with childcare, 2/3. So even if one decides that it's time for return into or reentry into the office, if the childcare, daycare, and camps are not available, that presents a serious operational issue that managers and companies will have to think through. What about customer engagement and clients? And can people do customer dinners? At which point in time? All these questions are unanswered, and all of us are pretty much navigating uncharted waters from the perspective of how do you manage your business continuity, but at the same time, how do you protect your enterprise and your company from liability? And then most importantly, how do you make sure that your employees are safe and that you are giving them assurance that you're thinking about all this? So next slide, please. So how do you implement a framework that is giving you a room to balance all of these aspects? And we've been working on this for weeks. I'm showing you here the highest levels of the framework. There's so much behind this, and we don't have enough time in 7 minutes to discuss all the details, but I'd be happy to give anyone more information if you need it or you're thinking about getting ready for your own reentry. Our framework starts honestly with assessing pandemic levels and understanding our business requirements. So when I say assessing pandemic levels, I mean, we will be looking at categories of indicators that will tell us if a location is pandemic level red, orange, yellow, blue, right? Or green. Green is actually post-vaccine, so no one is in green yet. Red, you can imagine, is where numbers of new cases per day are still escalating. There's no flattening of the curve, and hospital capacity is an issue, testing is an issue, monitoring is an issue. And you can assume that, orange from that point on and yellow gets better step by step. Government indicators will be looking for restrictions being lifted, anything from schools reopening to gatherings permitted to social distancing measures being unwinded. Health indicators are critical, and this is why we're not only looking at a government indicator to consider site for reentry. We're looking for 2 weeks of sustained reduction in new cases. So at a minimum 14 days to consider a location to even be anywhere near orange or yellow. We're looking for testing availability. We're looking for both diagnostic and antibody testing availability in the country. More diagnostic because there's a lot of controversy around the antibody testing. We're looking for hospital capacity and availability of therapeutic treatment. And then very importantly, benchmarking with other companies in that particular location, similar to us. So what have they done? How are they considering their reentry? Is public transportation available? Do people feel that it's safe? If we are asking less than 10% of the population in that location to re-enter the office and they are not safe taking public transportation, how will we get them to the office safely? All those things are now new considerations that previously as a leader, as a manager, you probably didn't have to think through. And when you look at the indicators and you combine them into a model, we have a model around this that we apply, it gives us a sense of how safe or unsafe is it to trigger a return. And based on the level of the pandemic, the operating guidelines will be prescribed in terms of who goes back, how they go back, and how that office is managed for safety. Next slide, please. So looking at how would you apply this now? So the next, again, highest level of the framework is if you understand the environment in that particular location and you understand that you have critical business needs. An important thing to remember is all of us are talking about reentry, but many of us have existing essential workforce in certain buildings. So we've never fully shut down certain buildings, especially critical ones where you have labs and you need access to servers and you need access to equipment. So there's a group of people that are already in those offices and have access to those offices, but it's a very limited group. Just to give you an example, in our Atlanta headquarters, our building can accommodate 6,000 employees. Currently, only 30 people have access to that building. So as we think about piloting reentry, we're thinking about less than 10% of the new capacity of the building. The new capacity of that building is a physical constraint that you have to really consider as you think about reentry. It means that if you apply social distancing measures, you will literally reduce your building capacity to around 40%. So you have physical constraints to consider. You need to think about business critical needs. There are engineers and there are populations that have to work in the office. They need access to equipment. They might need extra collaboration. They may have a critical customer deadline. So that weighs into what we think through and how we select a location. And then of course, who you pick to return has a lot to do with their work, the type of work, but also their individual constraints. Are they at risk? Do they have childcare or elder care constraints? How will the manager work through that? We're asking all of our managers to get trained on safety and operating guidelines. I'll show you an example of what those look like before we close. And all of our employees who are selected for the reentry pilots to also get trained before they walk into the building on day one. We're running 3 pilots, only 3, with less than 10% with the very select populations and not all pilots at the same time. We're looking to really learn and test our operating guidelines and understand, build trust, both with management and the employees. And it's truly the approach, if you want to summarize it in one sentence, is really not about meeting a deadline. It is really about being ready. Because as an employer, you really have to think about trust and assurance. None of us can claim that we've managed through a pandemic before, a global pandemic, and everything's new. And really thinking about and balancing your business continuity, getting back to your vision of growth and executing, driving engagement and managing these different populations that are working in the office, in the field, and at home, and their safety is very, very complex and very tricky. So final slide to wrap up. I get questions almost every day from other companies around operating guidelines. What are we thinking through? How are we thinking about operating guidelines? What will we implement? And here are the main categories of areas that you as an employer really have to think through before you send one person back into the office as a formal reentry. First and foremost, I spoke a lot about the job requirement. That means either why is that person going back? Have you really thought through the criteria? And are you considering resiliency planning? Team A, Team B, red team, green team, whatever approach you take, resiliency will be key. Are you thinking about the actual movement and activity inside the building? So anything from no visitors policy in the beginning to limiting and controlling third-party access to social distancing, which is pretty complex to implement. If you look at any floor plan, personal protection equipment, will you provide it? How will you make sure that people feel safe? What are your new cleaning protocols? What kind of screening and testing will you do? And most importantly, how will you actually drive compliance? What is your philosophy around it? And how will you document all this to make sure that you're learning, but also protecting the enterprise? So again, this is the highest level summary of a pretty complex project for any company to take on. But I think that you will not go wrong if you really establish early on your guiding principles, your filters that will drive all your decisions. And if you really think about employee safety as your primary filter. So that's it from us for today. I'll be on and happy to address any questions.
Thank you. So I told you before that it's really important to get questions, to get things going. And I see right now that we do have somebody who's raised their hand. So we should get that person to tell us what their question is. Let me take a look. I'll go back and see who that person is. 1 second. It looks like there is someone named Rolando Armas. So Rolando, I'm not sure what company you're with, or but if you have a question, please, we've unmuted you. Please go ahead and ask it, or a comment. Rolando, do you have a question? Okay. Anyway, if you raise your hand again if you have the question, and we'll unmute you and let you ask the question at that point in time. But who else has questions or would they like to ask of our panelists or make comments about what they're doing in their organization? Hafimi from Brunei, do you have any questions or comments to make about what you're hearing or where you're going?
Yeah, thanks, George, and thank you as well to the panelists for the presentations that they've given today. I think it's interesting to look at the various different approaches depending on the region that you're in. Here in ASEAN, obviously in Southeast Asia, and I mentioned this to George as well before, is there's some realignment in terms of talking about working together within countries to actually realign their manufacturing bases. Now, with the experiences, obviously from the panelists, is there something that can actually be advised to governments as a whole when they take these type of things into consideration? And that's probably just one question. And the second one is probably just a comment as to companies that look at their own supply chains and how it impacts in terms of micros feeding into their supply chains. The micro enterprises have been the hardest hit in this whole pandemic, and governments are scrambling to try and put things into place. So just wondering if they're seeing, if some of these major corporations are seeing this within their own supply chains and doing their own ESG evaluations as well in their whole moving forward strategy. Thanks, George. It's just a comment. That's not necessarily an answer at the moment, but just something to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good comment, and for sure, you're right about how governments and businesses need to work together to make this turn out to be right. Other questions or comments? I'm going to ask if we have none other. There's one question in the Q&A that I want to refer to Hans. Hans, I don't know if you've seen this question, but it says, first of all, it says, many thanks for the insightful perspective. It says, how would you reconcile the future supply chains being more local, not in all markets, especially higher tech supply chains might find all the things ready for that? Are there any trends you see, any hubs that come up, any channels that will drive localization, foreign investment, local producers building up, et cetera? So Ula's asking the question about higher tech supply chains and where they might be going. Hans, could you answer that question?
Yeah, excellent question, and not easy to answer, right? So we see actually companies like General Electric already before the crisis, already a couple of years ago, they started with this idea of building manufacturing plants into the markets where they also sell to. And the basic idea was really, and still is, to service customers better. And it really has a lot to do with the service operations of it. You see companies in, like I mentioned before, in the food industry with McDonald's having this concept since decades, really having a local approach. I think actually we see that same concept in more and more industries now in the future. And I think there will be hubs. Right? Good news is when I say local, it doesn't necessarily mean when you think about Europe now, in every single country you have a manufacturing plant. I would rather see it in really within the European Union, for example, or in areas where in Latin America, all the companies, countries actually are working together, at least the Spanish-speaking ones. So you would rather think of hubs than of really thinking of every single country, right? And then it's of course more the also the local suppliers, and this is definitely a trend which I see in the discussions that companies think about the resilience of the supply chain and think about qualifying suppliers more locally, still delivering the same quality of the product. Also, this goes hand in hand with the discussion on government. We didn't see actually that the supply chain in terms of sending products across countries has been impacted by the pandemic, right? So you see still actually a lot of products being sent around the world, and there's no additional restriction. I would even see some of the restrictions which have been put in place during trade wars going away in order to accelerate the economy globally again. I think actually this will probably be something we will see. Interestingly enough, I mentioned sustainability before. When you think about Europe and you listen to some of the leaders there on the government side, they really still want to emphasize that companies, when they restart and remodel their supply chain, think about products, that sustainability is a key measure. You see that less actually here in the US, right? So here in the US is actually taking away regulations, even if they would impact the environment. So I think there will be some different nuances in the world. In some areas, you will see an acceleration of these topics. In some areas, you will see more the idea of it's more important just get something going again and then think about sustainability, the other way around. Just some thought.
Thank you, Hans. I think you're absolutely right about that, and it makes me want to ask Maria a question. Maria, from NCR's perspective, do you see any differences across countries or cultures about the willingness to go back to work, to go back to the workplace, or do you see the same sort of pattern everywhere around the world?
Actually, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question. I do. On a daily basis, I have to remind some colleagues that different circumstances here exist, not just from the cultural perspective of how people are approaching the pandemic or experiencing it, but also from the personal perspective. So I'll give you one that might not be intuitive. Especially for people in North America or elsewhere, where people typically live in homes, and your living space might be a little bit bigger, and now you're at home with your spouse and your children, and you're homeschooling, and you're at the same time managing work. There are quite a few colleagues that we have in places around the world that they cannot wait for the re-entry into the office because their living space is actually a lot smaller. Just the square footage and their ability to actually be productive at home is not there. So we see that group. Then we see a significant population that is discovering work from home. So we have a work from home muscle in NCR. We've done it before. We've culturally shifted towards work in the office in the last 2 years under the new leadership team to build new culture and to get people to know each other and to get to know the new people. But now we're seeing that some of the leaders are recognizing that their productivity levels are actually better with certain employee populations. Their SLAs are up, absenteeism down, and they're actively watching the metrics to understand how they may actually sustain that, and can they sustain it once the pandemic is over? Because once the pandemic is over and the restrictions are lifted, people may not be as productive. They may go out to Starbucks for coffee, or they may stop at 5 and go watch a movie. So they're considering all that. There is that. And then I would say there is demographic difference as well. We have the younger employee populations, especially in software, really interesting, who are probably asking daily, when can they return to the office? And I think, again, that's an assumption that the re-entry into the office will be same as it was before. I think that people will have a pretty significant surprise when they actually re-enter the office and they see the new norm, the abnormal, where you have pretty prescriptive standards in terms of where you stand in the elevator and which way you walk in the hallway. And no, you cannot use the cafeteria because it's not open, and the gym is also closed. So I think there are very different reactions, and they're definitely cultural, they're definitely individual depending on the circumstances, and definitely age-based.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I'm sure you're right about those differences. And it's important to take those into account when you're doing a reentry. Let me ask for another question. Brian from Janus Logistics, do you have any questions or comments you'd like to make about this topic?
Yeah, hey, George. First of all, I want to say I thought Maria's content was outstanding. We expect nothing less from her, but it was really on point for what everyone's dealing with and great ways to measure the business. I also thought it was really interesting how something like a pandemic draws a real sharp focus to core leadership principles like messaging your people, clear expectations, the safety of your people, in addition to dealing with new things like social distancing. But I think it's pretty cool that they're really getting down to the basics around leadership as a good tool to deal with the current situation. And we're seeing that logistics is a contact sport with warehouses, delivery drivers, and all that stuff. And I think Amazon showed us over the last few weeks that if you don't take care of your people, or if there's extreme conflict internally, you can create some real problems for your business. As I think they had one of their senior software engineers leave the company over the treatment of their folks in the warehouse. So I thought Maria's content was really good. My question is really around the balance between agility and resilience. Hans talked about resilience. We talked about it on the last call. It can be expensive, and in my mind, resilience has to do with prescribing things for your supply chain that you are already aware of. You know, it's almost like a vaccine. Something's out there, you know it, you can build it into your supply chain, but it can be very expensive. Agility to me is something, you know, that deals with the unexpected. It plays right into some of the things that we're doing with the Institute and where supply chains are going in general. So I was just hoping to have some comments, maybe from Professor Sheffy, around the balance between resilience and agility within the supply chain.
Well, in this call, we don't have the professor as a speaker. However, I think Hans could answer that question. Hans, do you have any comments about or to reply to?
Yeah, it's a very good comment, right, and very good discussion here. I think you're absolutely right. It's resilience is kind of like a vaccine. But the other day, actually, I was just reading a report from David Simshalivi and Edith Simshalivi, and they actually introduced a very interesting thought. After the financial crisis, there was a stress test of banks, which was introduced, and they actually suggest that a stress test of supply chain should be introduced after this crisis. And they also discuss specific KPIs, what the stress test should include in order to ensure actually that breakdowns or distressed supply chains less happening or not happening anymore. And it's not about building up inventory. It's not about really making immediate changes, but really having this right KPIs where you really think about through the different elements of the supply chain, how you can think about this, what would happen in breakdown. So it goes in the direction of risk management, goes in the direction of calculation of the inventory levels, and also the supplier population in your supply chain. So I like this idea of stress test of supply chains actually quite a lot. I think they are researching there a little bit and expand on this a little bit more. And I'm looking forward to read more about this because I could see that actually being introduced.
Yeah, that's great. That's super. Thank you very much. So other questions or comments for our panelists? Okay, I have one. I'd like to ask NCR a question. When you think about the market and the demand signal, when you think about the demand that NCR is going to see over the next 2-3 years, how are you viewing it? Are you projecting that you're going to see a pickup, so supply chains need to start marshaling up and getting ready to produce more, or are you seeing it being a more gradual ramp up? Maria, do you have any comments about that?
That's a difficult one, and it's relatively difficult because we see mixed signals by industry. It's really interesting to see what we've observed from our customers. Banking, for the most part, is performing quite well. Both digital and traditional banking, you could see increased demand for technology so that they can provide access to services to customers in these newly required channels in safer ways. And that sort of is honestly has been quite pleasant surprise, not just from the perspective of the modernizing the bank branch, but the uptake on digital banking has continued. We've placed a significant amount of focus on growing our digital banking business and have a phenomenal leader who's done a great job last year. And we were slightly concerned in January where that was going to go. And then as you just watched, February, March, now banks continue to build their digital banking capabilities, which is great. I think that people are waking up to the importance of digitization. I think they were pitched to digital transformation for quite some time, but now I don't think it's a second thought or a back burner anymore. I actually think that people are understanding that that's part of both agility and resilience plan. If I can go back to Brian's comment, it should be part of your resilience plan and should be your agility muscle. In retail and hospitality, I'll save hospitality for last because that's the toughest one. In retail, you see, again, that's where you see mixed signals, and I think retail better than hospitality. It's been amazing to watch our grocery business at the speed at innovation and at which we had to deliver in the first quarter. Anything from new modes of self-checkout equipment to process changes and enabling the customers for process changes to enhancing and supporting their delivery capabilities. It's been tremendous. And we support some of the world's largest retailers and grocery chains. And this trend is pretty similar across the board. If you set geography aside, we've seen it everywhere. So for the grocery and major retail chains, really good evolution use of technology to perform better and to meet new demands. The department stores, very different story. We see these categories of customers that have challenges right now, and they're figuring out how to navigate the re-entry, and they're all trying to figure out how quickly will people feel comfortable to start spending again on things that are not considered essential, is what I would say. And then for hospitality, that is probably the most challenging one. And I would say there are multiple schools of thought. If you look at what's happening, in Asia, where the economies are reopening, there are restaurants that are, starting to pick up and going back to the new normal, but it's hard to see in North America or predict how quickly the general population will go back to, visiting restaurants in the way that we used to before. I think restaurants have significantly attempted to shift their operating model towards delivery and order takeout, and integrating quickly capabilities, software and services capabilities to do that. We've worked with hundreds and hundreds of them to basically turn them on, what we call turn them on overnight, to give them those capabilities, even in advance of their ability to get the stimulus so they can be operational. So I think that sector has been hit pretty hard, and I honestly cannot predict how quickly it will come back, but I do think it will. I do think it will come up with innovative models, and I do think that it will be where the balance is between the ghost kitchens or the order takeout delivery capabilities versus people going into the restaurant. I don't know. Yes.
Maria, thank you. Yeah, that great answer. But also we're out of time. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. We'll send you some materials if you'd like. Let us know if you want to get some summary of this meeting, and there's other things you can get from our website. But appreciate everybody joining us and look forward to talking to you during our next session. Thank you.